Dr. Jibran is an associate professor at Western University School of Medicine and Dentistry, and he spends most of his time studying topics in addictions and mental health. Some of his publications have focused on marijuana and alcohol use in adolescents, and more recently on the impact of vaping. Now, this is a topic that I've been meaning to talk to you about for a while, and just generally in addictions. And we've been talking a lot about mental health on the podcast itself. But one of the things that kind of prompted me to reach out to you in particular and talk about addiction, I read a book called The Molecule of More by Daniel Lieberman. It talks all about dopamine.
Okay.
And it kind of like shifted the way that I think about a lot of things.
Yeah.
And so I'm hoping we can talk a little bit about that. I know like a lot of people when they're thinking about addiction, they generally will think of like the hard drugs and that sort of thing that you, or like alcohol dependency and stuff. But I think it manifests in our lives in a lot of different ways, whether it's from the phone. We were just talking before we started about like screen time, like checking each other's screen time and how much time we spend on it. So
it is Sunday, so.
Yeah, exactly. So why don't we start with just a brief introduction of like what is addiction?
Yeah, so addiction, there's the technical definition and then there's how we understand it. And I think both of them are important. Addiction can be referred to as, in the technical terms, a chronic relapsing disorder, where somebody will try to abstain from whatever their addiction of choice is, whatever their proclivity, whatever they're vulnerable towards, they'll try to abstain from it, and then they'll relapse. And this is a chronic cycle. So abstinence, relapse, abstinence, relapse, abstinence, relapse. And that's how technically addiction is defined.
Mm-hmm.
We consider addiction usually in the context of substance use disorders, which is the drugs that you were mentioning, the hard or the not so hard drugs either. The brain really doesn't make a distinction between them.
Okay,
for the brain, a reward's a reward, and where there's a reward, the brain is vulnerable to getting trapped in compulsion towards that reward. And that's where I would put the sort of our understanding of addiction that's not technical is you feel this compulsive urge to go back to that thing that you're addicted to.
Mm-hmm.
And that compulsion drives your behavior.
And so one of the things that I found interesting is it's a relapsing where you're trying to stop it. So would you say that somebody is not addicted if they still want to do the thing? Like if whatever it is, if they want to continue doing it.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point, right? So when we think of addiction, especially when it comes to substances, we actually divide it into 3 stages of the addiction cycle.
Yeah.
There's that first stage, which is the euphoria, the positive affect that comes from using the drug. How good you feel. You feel like you're on cloud 9. Anybody that's had to take opioids can describe that feeling for pain, where you really feel that sense of euphoria. You're flying high, literally, right? And then when you take that away, you go through what might be something like a withdrawal, where you now no longer have the drug, you now feel the negative affect from it. And then, so you go from positive reinforcement, where now it's the positive effect that's driving the behavior, to then a negative reinforcement where the lack thereof makes you feel so crappy that you need to go back to the drug. And then so binge intoxication, negative affect, and then the third one is like preoccupation and craving. And so that would be, I think, the part that then leads to doing the drug again, is even when you're not in either state, you're still preoccupied and you're thinking about it and you're craving and you're thinking about it. And that then gets you to the back of the top of the cycle again.
Right.
And then you just go through the different phases of the cycle as you're going through. So I think that would go back to your question, because a lot of people who are addicted also would then spend a lot of time figuring out how to access their substance or behavior of choice. And so for people who are addicted to substances, they end up spending a large chunk of their monthly income on drugs. And when they no longer have money, then they're trying to figure out alternative drugs or alternative routes of getting the drugs or borrowing money or whatever. Like there is all sorts of things that go into it, but that is is a part of the addiction. And then I think if you were to extend that technical definition a little bit further, the other piece that I didn't mention earlier is that it is associated with negative consequences. So either your social life is affected, your ability to seek gainful employment is affected, your interactions with your family are affected, your ability to drive safely are affected. Like, so there are consequences that are negative in nature, and despite those negative consequences, you continue to use.
Right. And you kind of get the sense. I mean, the reason I asked the question is because oftentimes I feel like in scenarios like this, other people around you can see that you're addicted to something and you just don't see it yet. Like there's that denial phase at the beginning where it's like, oh, I could stop whenever I wanted to and that sort of thing. And people around you are going like, hey, no, you can't, slow down. Right. And so it's interesting that you tie that the person needs to be able to want to stop. But that doesn't happen immediately, right? And sometimes it happens too late, right?
The insight piece is often something that's missing. Right. And so having insight into as you were describing, into what might be problematic use of the substance, or when it's starting to affect you negatively in terms of your social life or occupation or whatever, people don't see it until it's often too late. And so that's where I think your point hits the nail on the head.
Yeah. And then the other thing I'm thinking about is people don't see it as a big deal if it's something that's not in one of these big categories that we talk about. Like we look at cell phone one, for example. Like that's an easy one where if somebody was listening to this and they're like, okay, I don't do any of these drugs, you probably spend a lot of time on your phone just like I do, and I'm sure you do as well. And it's a constant battle of like, I need to get off my phone.
And I think this is where it's important to separate out habits versus addictions.
Okay.
Right? So something might be a habit, but it might not be an addiction. But addictions generally do have a habitual component to it.
Okay.
Right? And so I think that's probably one place where where your phone use might be habitual, but it's still somewhere in the realm of either productive or neutral and has not fully moved into problematic use, right? Where it's not, it's not allowing you to have social relationships. It's not allowing you to keep holding on to a job. It's not affecting how you're driving. It might be affecting how you're driving, but it's all on a spectrum, right? And so that's where you have to sort of figure out where it goes from being potentially beneficial to then being problematic. And that's where I think the shift is important to recognize.
Yeah. And then, how do we get out of it before it becomes an addiction?
Yeah.
Right. And so I want to ask you a question actually. What is going on in our brains that will allow an addiction to form?
Yeah, so our brains are made essentially, especially if you consider it evolutionarily, right? A lot of the purpose of the brain is to monitor the environment and ensure success, whatever that success means. Evolutionarily, it might have meant, ability to procreate and all of that. And so but it is essentially scanning the environment at all times, looking at cues that are around us and helping us learn associations between those cues and outcomes.
Okay.
And that's what you mentioned, the neurotransmitter dopamine earlier. Its purpose is essentially to predict rewards. And whether there's a reward prediction error where there was something that you thought would predict a reward and did not end up in a reward. And you could have positive or negative reward prediction errors, or something that you predicted would not be rewarding and ended up being rewarding. And so that's its basic purpose. And so if you're going around and if you're out looking for food and you saw that this colored fruit would result in a food that would not be poisoned and you would find it scrumptious, then your brain keeps the track of that. And so now that's one of those cues that you look for in your environment. And so usually what you have in your brain is this something what we refer to as the brain reward circuit. This is, if you want to get technical, it's these dopaminergic circuits that project from parts of the midbrain into the frontal cortex and have these bi-directional relationships where the frontal cortex exerts control over the more basal, more limbic structures. These are evolutionarily older. These are the more animalistic parts of you that drive you towards
Like that intrinsic
desires,
nature, yeah.
and rewards and just chasing them. Whereas the frontal cortex is now this sort of control over it that the more human-like control. Or if you are to now have humans be placed somewhere between animals and angels, right? Like angels don't have the desires and have all of the control. Animals have all of the desires, none of the control, and we're sort of in the middle trying to find this battle, right? Like balance
Right.
between the two of them. And so usually food, drink, sexual activity, reproduction, procreation, all of those things activate the brain reward circuit.
Right.
Cause dopamine release, and that means that anything that activates the brain reward circuit is your brain's cue to invigorate that behavior, and you're going to do more of it as time goes on. The first time you realize this food tastes really good, you're going to keep going back for more.
Yeah.
This drink tastes really good. This activity feels really good, and you're going to keep going back for more. So that's the purpose of it, is invigoration. But there's dopamine release, and then there's dopamine release after a drug, which basically blows what you had before out of the water. These drugs, cocaine, alcohol, cannabis, nicotine, all of them increase the levels of dopamine in the brain to levels far exceeding what might be normally rewarding.
Right.
And so now, if it's all about signal to noise, right? Whatever you felt before is no longer going to be rewarding.
It's not going to make you as happy. Or
Yeah.
Okay.
And so now you're going to be more and more dependent on seeking those highs and those pleasures that you faced after the drug. And so that's basically what's happening. It's how we often refer to it as your brain, or your brain reward circuit, is hijacked by these drugs. What was meant to be productive, what was meant to be something that conferred evolutionary advantage or helped you seek goals and reach them, and helped you, function in society. Because even social interactions, like you and I talking, also release dopamine. Right? And, this is why even when we think of the insan, right, like the human being, we find joy in being with each other, find joy in being in communities, because that's also a source of dopamine release. But now something comes along and nothing else compares.
Yeah.
And usually for food, you have to go out and get a job and work and do all of that, right? Like, so there's the effort versus the reward. Right. And that now you can start to see for things then when it goes out of balance, when you can get a whole hit of dopamine without a lot of effort, then you can see how it might skew your future decision making away from things towards other things.
Right. Like I'm as you were saying that, I'm thinking of the example of like the parent who's trying to get their teenage son to like drop the video games and go outside.
Yeah.
Right? Because it's like you're competing with a dopamine level that is just, and it's so easy. You don't have to go anywhere. You don't have to do anything. Your body doesn't have to burn any calories. It doesn't have to move. Your brain your brain works as you're like playing the games, but it's now, it's here, and it's huge. Versus it's like, if I want to go outside, it's a whole process. My brain's like, I might have a good time, but that might be in an hour or two when I get to where I'm going.
And the other part of the brain that actually plays an important role in that is our brain's other sort of focus is to maintain homeostasis, right? Like so for example, I'll give you an example of so the people who take ice baths, over time they get used to the ice bath, that cold temperature. Usually, if any of us who don't take ice baths, we went in there, we'd be freezing. But over time, your brain, what it does is it turns the dial on what it feels and what it doesn't feel to now come to a new homeostatic set point, right?
Yeah.
Like where what was too much for you to handle before now is not too much to handle because it's now adjusted on the other side. So now while dopamine is being released, there is something that dopamine needs to act on. Dopamine just doesn't exist in a vacuum, right? So dopamine is released, it goes and acts on dopamine receptors on other neurons, on postsynaptic neurons, as we call them.
Okay.
What your body does is, okay, too much dopamine, too much dopamine, too much dopamine. Now I need to now tamper it down, reduce the effect of it somehow. So what I'm going to do is reduce the number of receptors that I can't do anything about the excess dopamine that's being released. I'm going to reduce the number of keys that are there. So if you think of locks and keys, you've got a lot of keys. Now you're going to reduce the number of locks that that key can act on.
Okay.
And so to change it forward. Now that dopamine is there. But now when you try to get your child to go outside and stop playing video games, there was a lot of dopamine release coming from the video games. Now, if you do finally convince them to go outside and play ball hockey or basketball, not only are there fewer keys that are being released, but the locks have also come down because your brain had tampered that signal down.
Right.
And so even the few keys that are there are not opening up a whole bunch of locks either.
Yeah.
Right? So you are almost working against yourself and against your brain when you're trying to now find an alternate reward that may take its place.
I'm thinking as you're saying that, I'm thinking you could use this if you knew how to tune it properly, you could use this for your benefit.
Yeah.
Where and this is the case where, like, for example, now I'm at a point where I'm exercising regularly and it feels good to exercise. Like I'm going to the gym and it's like I like doing this. Right? But on the other hand, for example, there's certain cases where when it comes to food, for example, I might really want that like greasy cheeseburger and my brain's like dopamine hit, it's going to be fantastic. It's going to be great. And then 20 minutes later, I know after I eat it, I was like, I'm going to feel terrible. Right? And so my brain is almost like, is the dopamine thing, the effect of it, is your brain's only thinking very short term, right? It's not like a long-term thought process when it comes to dopamine, or is it a little bit more complicated than that?
It's a little bit more complicated than that because it's just one stop along the way.
Okay.
Dopamine is one piece of the puzzle where there are all sorts of other neurotransmitters and neuromodulators that are also in tandem with dopamine helping you make the decisions that you make. So it might be acetylcholine and it might be glutamate and GABA, which are your primary like activating or excitatory versus inhibitory transmitters in the brain. And so there's this dopamine is one path along the way or one player along the way that is definitely helping you see, is this rewarding or not? Is this something I should do again or not? But then other systems come into play. And going back to the piece that I was talking about earlier, oftentimes you go from positive reinforcement where initially something feels really good. But after a while, that goodness of it does no longer feel the same. And you'll see that for a lot of behaviors that are supposedly addictive, initially the happiness, the euphoria, the high that you felt doesn't stay. And what is actually then driving the behavior is that negative reinforcement piece that we talked about earlier. Now you're just doing it to get out of the icky feelings that you have when you don't have that drug.
So that I remember reading in the book was the defining feature of like nicotine, where nicotine, if I'm correct, doesn't really give you much of a high. It's more so once you've had it, it's just trying to get you back out of that low that you're in.
Yeah. And so compared to other drugs, nicotine is not as strong of a reinforcer by itself. But what it does is, going back to dopamine, it makes the sights and sounds and lights and cues and everything else in the environment that much more salient. So you're like, oh, I really liked how that cigarette felt in my mouth. And I like the smell of the smoke. And that's why when I wake up, I need to have that first thing in the morning. And so it's what it's done is enhanced the salience of all of those other things that go along with it. So people even who will chew a gum, a nicotine gum, for example, will be like, I miss the feeling of the cigarette in my mouth or the patch. And that's why they'll choose to chew a gum instead, because this was like, oh, I'm moving my mouth. Or,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Like, so there are things that they miss that are part of the process that were enhanced by nicotine, even though by itself it may not have been the most rewarding substance in
Interesting.
the world.
Yeah, because people be like a lot of people, like, especially in the Middle East and
Yeah.
stuff, they'll like wake up and they'll have like a cigarette and coffee,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
the coffee will taste better. And
Yeah,
like, it's
yeah,
annoying.
everything
It's like
tastes better with it, and that's where I think it's a big thing when even when you were saying earlier, right? Like we were like you were saying that most people will think that I am not addicted to these drugs, so I don't have an addiction. And oftentimes in Masajid and centers and talking to students, especially in our community, I'll ask, "Do you know somebody with an addiction?" And not a lot of hands will go up.
Mhm.
And I'll say, smoking is an addiction, and then half the
Everyone.
hands go up, right? And that's where we've decided that some things we're okay with. These
Yeah, yeah.
addictions are acceptable for us. Smoking, that's fine. Pornography, that's fine.
Yeah.
Just the hard drugs, alcohol,
Yeah,
cannabis,
yeah.
those are not fine. And so that's where I think there's some double standards that we also have as a community.
Hmm. And then specifically on nicotine, like I felt like with my generation, not a lot of people that I know in my generation were smoking, because there was like a really strong like anti-smoking push and all that
Yeah.
kind of stuff. And then I found it actually rebounded with the generation younger than me with vaping. And with vaping and with like argile and like hookah use and that sort of stuff, now I feel like it's like skyrocketing again. So maybe we start with, we know its prevalence. You don't need to talk about how prevalent it
Yeah.
is. I think everyone
Yeah.
knows somebody who's vaping or not.
Yeah.
How do we stop it?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good question. And this actually, shows you how public policy and addiction research is always playing catch up, right?
Mhm.
So the tobacco industry first realized that they were taking some L's, right? Like
Yeah, yeah.
they took some big losses, big lawsuits, they were having to pay out all of this stuff. And they were seeing these like marked declines in smoking, where in the 60s and 70s, up to 70% of people were smoking, down to like 12 to 15% at a population level. And then came the idea of e-cigarettes, as they're referred to, or what the product that you're using when you're vaping, being a smoking cessation aid. Oh, if you use e-cigarettes,
Yeah.
this will help you stop smoking.
Right.
And that's what they were initially marketed towards. And yes, they are safer than cigarettes. But then again, that's not a high bar. Cigarette smoking remains the single largest preventable cause of death worldwide, even to this day. And the projected numbers, especially because of the number of smokers in China and India, those projected numbers are huge. By 2030, like hundreds of millions of people will lose their lives directly due to smoking. So the bar is not very high. Like
Right.
I can probably say that my car's exhaust is safer than cigarettes, right?
Right.
But that's how it started, and then combined with effective and active social media based marketing and campaigns. You saw all of these people doing, going back to the Argila example or the Shisha example, hookah example, the people would blow rings and see how long they can inhale for and all of that.
Yeah.
You started seeing, so they took the best of what they saw working with water pipes and hookahs and shishas and saw if they could gamify it and make it a trend with vaping. And so people would be blowing rings and circles and dragon
Like giant
inhales and
clouds
giant clouds and French inhales and all of those things. And that took off.
Right.
And then you basically had a generation of what would have been never smokers otherwise taking up vaping. And the consequence, or one of the consequences that data shows us, is that somebody who vapes is more likely to go on to become either a smoker or a dual user. So they're both vaping and smoking at the same time, and also at a greater likelihood of going on to vape or smoke cannabis as well. And so what they ended up doing through this way is creating a whole new generation
Right.
of future smokers, which then
With the
helps
smoking cessation device.
yeah, right. And this is the greatest trick the devil played on the youth, essentially. And then because it's there's the perceived reduced harm. And then it's also electronic. And for the digital natives, you can actually see how many hits you have left. And you can connect it to your Bluetooth. And it's not. And all of the problems that public policy had solved, like, indoor smoking bans. So that meant you had to take a break from work.
Right.
You had to go outside. You had to have a unit of a cigarette that you had to light, and you had to get through the whole cigarette. And in fact, FDA had asked the cigarette, or not asked, but mandated that they include accelerants in the cigarette, for example, that helps it burn faster. They also mandate the inclusion of irritants. So if you take too deep of a hit, you start coughing. And so those were things were required. They, in one fell swoop, did away with those things,
Right.
where now you can have flavors. You can have fruit and strawberry and mango and cool ice mint. And
You're like walking down the street. It
yeah,
smells like cookies and cream here.
Yeah,
Like, it's like some guy
yeah,
smoking in front of you.
essentially, right? Like, and so you did away with the accelerants and you did away with the irritants, and you actually ended up adding more things that are now going to make it appealing, right? Flavors and scents and smells, and there's no longer a unit anymore. You don't have to get through the whole cigarette. Anytime you're walking from one place to another, you can hit it.
Yeah.
You can hit it an endless number of
too,
times.
right?
Yeah, secretly, endless number of times. I was on a plane recently, and they say vaping and smoking is not allowed on the plane. And the person sitting next to me must have hit the vape multiple times throughout the flight, just like discreetly, and covering it up and doing it, or inhaling the rest of the vapor, not exhaling at all. And so people do it a lot more. And so any behavior that you repeat and repeat it an endless number of times, and you keep going, and you're not just relegated to those moments of, after 2 hours of work, I can go out for a 10-minute smoke break. Now you're just
It gets scarier and
over
scarier.
and over and over. And anything you repeat becomes a habit, in addition to whatever the effects of the drug
And it's like
are.
built into your whole life, because it's not, like you said, it's not set to intervals anymore.
Yeah.
And so in your view, it's like public policy has to sort of lead the way on this, and then anything we can do in our own communities.
Well, as as a pharmacologist and as somebody who went into this field trying to see how I could design better drugs to help people quit. And my PhD was all on tobacco use and smoking, and that's where it all started, and then moved to alcohol and cannabis. And so that was the goal. But I have to be honest, what changes in public policy we're able to do to bring down the rates of smoking, no drug has ever been able to do, and probably will never do. And so that's why I would say that public policy is probably the best lever that we have. You change the taxes on cigarettes, you change how much people smoke.
Yeah, it's
You
just
change-
too expensive.
Right?
Right?
So there are all of those things that I think can be real levers that can be used. As far as our community is concerned, I think there needs to be more awareness. Parents don't know what their kids are doing, right? Like, we used to be able to use the hadith of the Jalisus Salih and the Jalisus Su to talk about smokers, right? Like, there you have the good friend and the bad friend. The good friend is the one who smells like perfume or sells perfume, and then is the Nafiqul Kir, the one who's the blacksmith. And we could be like, okay, maybe you don't know what a blacksmith is, but you definitely know what a smoker is. And so if you had ever been in a car with a smoker, not only did you know, but everybody in your circle, in your family, your wife, your mom, everybody knew. Where are you coming from? You smell like smoke, right? Like, you knew that.
Now
But
you smell like bubble mint.
Right? Like, those telltale signs are no longer there. Kids are telling their parents, oh, this has no nicotine in it. Oh, it's just like a shisha, and they like draw on their cultural proclivity too, where it's like, oh, it's just like a shisha. And even the shisha, right? Like, what people don't realize is the hookah or the shisha is actually far more dangerous than even cigarettes, right? Like, they're like, oh, it goes through water, and that somehow purifies it, right? Like, most tobacco-specific nitrosamines, the cancer-causing agents, are actually not soluble in water anyways. They're lipid soluble, or they would only come out in a oil-based solution, for example.
Yeah.
But also, because you're passing it through water, the temperature goes down, and so you're able to inhale it. And that's why people are like can inhale so much of it. You might be inhaling so much more than you could ever inhale from a cigarette. And so that is getting deposited deeper and deeper into your lungs. And that is all going to and what's the ma'sal, or the whatever is being used in the shisha, is actually tobacco. It's literally cured tobacco with flavorant in it. And tobacco is the reason. In fact, what's in e-cigarettes is pure nicotine. What's in cigars and cigarettes and shisha and hookah and all of those are tobacco. And tobacco has what is the carcinogenic, what is the cancer-causing substance. Nicotine itself is not cancer-causing. The problem that comes from vaping is, while there's the ijma' of the scholars that smoking is haram, because you are taking with your own hands towards destruction, right? You can't necessarily, in the same equivocal manner or certain manner, say the same thing about vaping, because vaping itself does not cause cancer. But what it is doing is it's opening the door to you now becoming a smoker, which then would lead you to cancer. And so, at least as a sadda zari'ah, like as a place of stopping or closing the door to future harm, that's where vaping would fall under that category. But then that's also going to be different. It's going to be different for a 14-year-old versus a 50-year-old. A 50-year-old who was smoking, for them, I would say e-cigarettes are the lesser of the two evils, right? Lesser harm, and that would actually help them reduce their risk for.
Right, but when you see someone vaping who never smoked in the first place, it's like, what
so
are we doing?
that becomes the challenge for jurists to be able to make recommendations to the community. It was almost easier with smoking, where you could get on the member and say, haram for everybody, you should not do it. Now, how do you have that nuanced conversation about e-cigarettes or vaping?
Yeah. It's an interesting one. I mean, it's one where people need to just get to, like, especially I'm talking about the young kids who are like smoking shisha once a week with their friends or whatever. You got to get to a point where you just ask yourself, okay, is this better? Is this something that's bringing me closer to where I want to be or further away from it? And if you can answer that simple question, then you can move on with your life and get this thing out of your life forever. Because not waiting until the point where it becomes an addiction to start trying to remove it. Because every single person who's smoked long term will tell someone not to smoke, because khalas, they're stuck at that point, right? You mentioned about youth specifically, and one of the things that is difficult is marijuana use in youth. So I went to high school here in Canada. I would say like a third of my classmates at that point had probably smoked some marijuana, or probably even a bigger proportion of them had been drinking alcohol and that sort of thing. So this is very prevalent. If your kid goes to school here in Canada, they're going to come across this, guaranteed. And I remember seeing several people, classmates of mine, who just let it take over their lives, and it just destroyed their life. Like then, and that's the end of it. It's very difficult to recover from that. I remember one of my classmates, it was to the point where he was smoking every single morning before he came to school. And I was like, dude, like you gotta stop this, right? Like this is ridiculous, right? You're smoking every single day. And he was saying, well, I cannot come to school and focus if I don't smoke marijuana in the morning. And it's like, at 14, 13 years old, what is that doing to your brain?
Yeah, no, so the brain is still developing, right? The brain stops developing around 25. So what happens initially is when somebody's born, your brain essentially overgrows, right? Like you're learning everything about your environment, everything is around you. So using the example of trees outside, like the branches are just growing and forming in every way. That's why you'll see kids able to pick up something and, go from like toddling or stumbling around to within 2 days to be able to walk, and
Mm.
language and whatever else it is, and they like just take everything in as sponges, like sponges, is because your brain is essentially forming these new connections and synapses at all times. And then what happens is it actually around adolescence going into the teenage years, it starts to prune back some of those extra synapses that were happening, so refining the brain circuits to now what will eventually be an adult stage. And so this period of adolescence is a very unique period
Mm-hmm.
where the brain is going through a lot of changes. And that change, that essentially serves as the prism through which any exogenous influences, any outside factors like drug use, like social inclusion or exclusion, like trauma, like conflict, like any of those things are now going to pass through that prism of the changes that are happening during this period in your brain, now possibly stamping it more permanently than what would happen in an adult brain.
Mm-hmm.
Adult brain, you're kind of set. The influences do have their sort of effect, but it's shorter lasting. It's not going to permanently change the development of your brain or the state of your developed brain. And so when it comes to substance use, we actually know that there are substance use is often referred to as a pediatric problem because the earlier you start,
Mm.
the greater your risk of developing a future substance use disorder. The later you start, the lower your risk. And so you see it go down. If you start at 13 versus you start at 18, your risk is a quarter of what it was if you started at 13.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's an important piece. In addition to that, because your brain is going through so many changes, you can actually see long-term changes in the brain structure and function after adolescent drug use. You see changes in cognitive function, and so how you're able to function, how well you're able to solve problems and figure things out. You see changes in psychopathology. So you see if you use drugs like alcohol, nicotine, cannabis during adolescence, your chances of having a future anxiety disorder or a psychotic disorder, especially in the case of cannabis, or future depressive disorder, are much greater compared to those who never used substances in the first place.
Interesting.
And on top of that, if you use early and you use often, your chances of continuing to use, and in fact, not just using without problem or without consequences, but actually developing a substance use disorder also go up greatly. And so that's why this is a unique window or a unique period of vulnerability that then changes that outlook for the future.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is, not only is this vulnerable time for the brain in terms of the changes, but it's also the time where you see changes in how teenagers behave, right? Like you go from having parental affiliation to having now more peer affiliation, right?
Right.
Like that's your socialization now. That's who you're looking for influence. That's who you're, and you don't want to listen to your parents, right? On top of that, like you also have, again, talking about the higher brain versus the lower brain, your limbic circuits, your desire structures are on overdrive, and your prefrontal cortex has just not developed yet. And so that imbalance again leads you to want to do, oh, I want to take risks. I want to drive faster. I want to try new things. I want to try drugs. I want to do what my friends are doing. And your brain, your frontal cortex is no longer trying, or is not developed enough that it can press the brakes on that. Right?
Right.
So it's like the worst storm of all of these factors coming together that then ends up
Mm-hmm.
showing up in what you were describing in the classmate.
Yeah. And the tough thing is with that one in particular has been that there's been such like a PR campaign for it, right? Everyone's like, oh, it's natural, it's not addictive. I don't understand where this non-addictive thing came from because everybody that I know that has smoked it is like semi-permanently addicted to it.
Yeah.
But there's been a PR campaign for it, right? And now it's readily accessible in all of Ontario or all of Canada, I guess.
Yeah, and that's where the we already, even before legalization for cannabis, had the highest youth cannabis rates in the world already. Where and since legalization, nearly half of the people between the ages of 20 and 25 report smoking in the last year. Over a third of them between the ages of 15 to 20 reported. And so they're the rates are very high, no pun intended, in Canada, and but they were already high even before legalization, and that's it's the public perception matters, but also in addition to that, I think as society shifts and as we see the influences that shape us shifting, people have less and less social interaction that's not on their phones, right? So we don't have those potential protective factors that may have existed, like you were saying with your earlier example, go outside and play, and right, like there's all of those things, and we're becoming more and more insular, and so it often becomes, okay, what am I going to do with my time? I guess I could just smoke and get high, or smoke some cannabis or whatever. And so there's all of these factors that are happening at the same time that contribute to changes, and possibly contribute to the high prevalence of it. And I think, again, as we were talking about vaping, this is again something that, especially in our community, needs more education, more psychoeducation, but also just talking about it more. A lot of parents have no idea what cannabis is or what cannabis does, and the kids can get away with it now, especially with vaping. Maybe it had the characteristic smell that you might remember from high school. That's no longer the case if it's a vape or a concentrate. You don't have that, all the terpenes that would have given it that skunk-like smell. You don't have that anymore. You might even have flavorants or additives to it, or you can have gummies and brownies, and like where you'll never know what somebody's using, right? And so I think there, again, more education is required. I remember when cannabis was first legalized. That was actually my first trip to London. Sheikh Harij invited me to a little panel, or do a talk at LMM right around October 2018 to come talk about cannabis. And I remember I had brought my family along, and a young sister actually followed us all the way to the parking lot, arguing, why is coffee halal if cannabis is haram? And like would not. I was like, I'm going back to Guelph. I'm sorry, I can't argue this any further with you. And so there's like very strong convictions as well. And people will, just like the natural thing you were saying, Allah would not have put it on this earth if it wasn't halal. So like absolutely the most mind-boggling of excuses people will come up with.
So let's shift gears a little bit, and I want to talk about what I call the elephant in the masjid. Okay, and that's related to like pornography addictions. So that's the one where, if marijuana use and tobacco use and stuff is now hidden, that's the one that gets like stowed away entirely, and is almost impossible to detect. But at the same time, I mean, we've seen examples of it ruining relationships and marriages and all kinds of things. And so, where do we start with addressing that one?
I think we can start right at the beginning, right? When we were talking about what is the purpose of the brain reward circuit. And one of those things that was rewarding or inherently rewarding was romantic connection and intimacy, and because that then drove you towards reproduction and increased your, and so you see it in the animal kingdom. And so if it's that animalistic part of you, you had to, the birds and the lions and whatever have to do the mating rituals, and right, to be able to exert dominance. And so all of that work was required to eventually get a mate that then you can mate with and then have children, right? Like that was what was required. And it was the same for our grandparents and parents, right? Like you had to go find a job, you had to get an education, you had to make a man out of yourself, you had to do all of that to then be able to eventually get married and to fulfill this part of your religion. It's half of your deen for a reason, right? Like that was, and so now in this microwavable meals drive-through culture that we live in the world, you take away all the hard parts and you give access to things that if you told our parents or grandparents about what kids have access to these days, they wouldn't even understand. Like it would be so far beyond their realm of understanding.
Right.
Right? Like if you think about like the seeing the ankle for Imam Malik as being something that made him lose his memory. Right? Like imagine what world we live in now.
Yeah.
And it's all available wherever you are, whenever you are, at the swipe of a phone, at the click of a button, completely discreet. Nobody has to know about it. Even your partners don't know about it. People living in your own home don't know about it. Your parents have no idea.
Right.
Right? And so how do you then put that toothpaste back in the tube? Right? How do you undo that?
Right.
And so a parent might think, oh, I'll just get him married and this will fix it.
Yeah.
No, you're just ruining two lives now. Right? Like there is, and just like we were talking about the gaming example, it applies here as well. Right? Like what he's had access to or what she's had access to, and like the numbers are actually, we're probably reaching parity in men and women. Even in our community, it's not just like a boy problem anymore. It's not like things are like this is probably the one that we have fully lost control on. Like the reeling it back is going to require us talking about it, us doing something with it. Otherwise, we're probably, even the problems we're seeing right now are probably just the tip of the iceberg.
And the crazy thing about it that I find is that it is so easy to trigger. So somebody could actually be putting in an extreme amount of effort to stay away from it. And then they open up like an Instagram app or a Twitter app or whatever, and something catches their eye, right? And it's like it's not like a tobacco or a smoking where you've got to go and buy it and use it and that sort of thing. It's like a constant battle with a lot of people where it's like they're struggling to lower their gaze. That's essentially
that's what it is. And then you can understand why the algorithms for Instagram or TikTok or so. Like I don't have TikTok. I don't have a TikTok account. But even when somebody sends me a TikTok link, and you watch it without, guess what the next video that's coming up is. Right? It has no idea who I am. It has not programmed the algorithm based on my likes or dislikes, but it's gonna try to sell me something that is scantily clad, that is going to pull me in, maybe make me make an account, something like that.
Right.
And it's the same thing on Instagram. Right? Like they talk about how subhanAllah, it's like, this is where it starts, right? And maybe I'm drawing too much of a line, but even the women influencers, the Muslim women influencers will say that when I bring my husband onto the video, my videos do better than when I don't have my husband on the video.
Interesting.
Right? Like they'll actually say, or the men will say, when I bring my wife onto, like every one of these little things and these marketing ploys and the algorithm is designed to keep you going down that rabbit hole and going further and further down. And every one of them, just like you said, that cue is we actually refer to as cue-induced relapse. Right? So somebody may have gone to rehab for alcohol or another drug, and then they come back and they see the cue. They see the bar. They see the place where they used to smoke. They see where they used to drug. And that cue is enough to then pull them right back into it. And all of that effort that had been spent digging out of it, all gone down. Right? And so as good as it felt to be able to dig it, now it feels even worse. Right?
And there's a shame component to this one that doesn't apply as much to the other ones, right?
So seeking help, and that's one of the things that they often talk about, is that the criminalization of substance use actually prevents people from seeking help.
Right.
And that's why legalization, now what you're seeing in terms of increases in cannabis use disorder or anything else, are because more people are willing to come forward saying and accepting that they have a problem than what they might have done before when it was illegal. And so then the taboo around it in our community definitely affects it. And subhanAllah, if you think about it, in the Quran, we see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bringing together the things that are substances of addiction and behaviors of addiction. Khamr wal maisir comes together. Alcohol
Interesting.
and
Yeah.
gambling. Gambling is a behavioral addiction as old as time, and it's they come together. When you think about when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the two things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells actions, right? Like there's the other ayat about the wealth of the orphan, for example, but about zina, you're told don't go close to it. When it comes to alcohol, don't go close to prayer when you're sukara, right? So because the vulnerability is there, right? Like don't go close to it, and that's where even our scholars in the past, like Ibn al-Qayyim, rahimahullah, he Rawd al-Muhibbin, in one of these books, he actually talks at length about addictions, and he actually there again brings up alcohol and sex as the two addictions. This is like 700 years or at least 300 years before the Calvinist priests would ever talk about this in this manner. And he talks about it's like a bird that's now trying to grab something from a trap, and because it has the reward in its trap, it can't get its head out, and it remains stuck in there. And that's what he literally describes the process of addiction as. And he goes through all of the different aspects of it. We were talking about tolerance, and we were talking about how nothing else feels good. He says that the person who is engaged in either alcohol or a sex addiction, they don't feel a tenth of the pleasure that somebody who is not engaged in it feels. So that you've actually gone from positive reinforcement to that negative reinforcement, where it's just not even being driven by pleasure anymore, and it's just being driven by the negative affect when you don't have it. And so I think that the same things that we've been talking about with drugs apply to pornography as well. The context applies, just like you have cue-induced reinstatement, you have context-induced reinstatement, where just going back to the context where you used to use before, where you then brings that back on. And so that's where accountability to someone more than yourself, maybe getting an accountability partner where you're like, okay, you're my friend. I can't talk about this with anybody else. I can't even talk about this with my spouse because they're going to feel betrayed by this. But I want to stop. You first make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and you ask Allah for help, and you ask Allah to take you out of this and replace it with something and all of that. But in addition to that, you come up with a plan for accountability, browser blockers and lockdown on your system, and somebody else who can keep you honest, and somebody who can keep you, those are the things that you have to do. And I think this is something, again, that our community needs to come up with real, viable, scalable solutions for, right? Because you have your programs, some programs like Lower Your Gaze, etc. First of all, for most youth that have gotten into it, they're too inaffordable for them to even be able to access. They're not scalable. They're not able to do it discreetly. They're not able to. So we don't have real solutions, and I think this is one of those important topics that I think we need more discussion on, but also put our brightest minds together to try to come up with real solutions for, because of how ubiquitous it is. It's there and it's everywhere.
And you mentioned something, I mean, the point about getting somebody married or whatever the case, and even for some of the youth, they may think like, oh, this is a temporary problem that I don't really have to address because it'll be resolved once I get married. And it's like, hold on a second, pump the brakes. This is not going to be resolved.
It's not good.
And this is in fact going to destroy your marriage if you allow it to.
And again, it's that same thing, right? Like the number of keys is going to be low, and the number of locks is already tampered down. And that's why you see people moving to more and more extreme forms of what they're watching and what they're consuming, is because your brain builds tolerance. And so whatever used to be enough before is no longer enough. And just like with the drugs, whatever was enough before is no longer enough. So you're moving to harder drugs. You're often moving to harder images or more extreme behaviors. And I think the other piece that it's really contributing to that we don't talk about enough, I think I have often talked about it in the context of the images we've seen, astaghfirullah, in the last year and a half from Gaza,
Mm-hmm.
right? Where now our brains have now adjusted to seeing them, and only the
Mm-hmm.
most extreme of images will now elicit a response. It's the same tolerance effect.
Yeah.
Now, and so, and I often talk about how that is actually contributing to the further dehumanization of our brothers and sisters,
Absolutely.
right? Think about how the images that you view are dehumanizing women for you,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like the respect and honor that you're supposed to have for your wives, and the rifqan bil qawarir and all of that, and what you view, how that shapes your view.
Mm-hmm.
And then you get into, the 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 alpha male bro culture from your
Mm-hmm.
Andrew Tates of the world, and the way like you can directly draw
Yeah.
a line between the two, and that's what our kids, our youth
Yeah.
are listening to. And so that, I think that's the other piece of it, that
Mm-hmm.
just imagine the long-term effects it's going to have, and maybe we'll end up exactly back where the people were in the days of Jahiliyyah, where they would bury their daughters, right? Like
Mm.
now, nothing's sacred anymore,
Right.
right? Like how you treat women is going to be impacted by what you see and what you're okay with, and how you.
Yeah.
So that, I think there are impacts beyond just what we're seeing as like the tip of the iceberg, marriage problems. I
Yeah.
think the long ranging impacts
The
and the
moral
knock on
decay,
effects
right?
are going to be more insidious and far more widespread.
Yeah. It's interesting. This conversation in particular is starting to get more and more mainstream traction from people who, I mean, you might think, like, some people might listen to this and thinking this is like a Muslim
Yeah,
point of view,
yeah,
that like Muslims don't like this because it's against our
yeah,
religion and this sort of thing. But people who are not religious are
yeah,
talking about this exact same thing of how it's destroying
yeah.
relationships and it's creating issues. And I think even recently, Theo Vaughn had somebody on his podcast to talk
Okay.
about the dangers of the industry and
Yeah.
like the details of what's going on in the
Yeah.
industry and behind the scenes and that sort of thing. And so this is
And
a conversation that I think we can lead on.
what may have been presented as like a empowerment thing initially, right? Like this is the other problem is capitalism and consumerism.
Yeah, yeah,
It remains a big problem in this, right? So like something like OnlyFans is like, oh, we're empowering the creators, like their own mental health, what they talk about, what they're going through in
yeah.
terms of the content that they need to produce, and how, again, to keep up with the demands, that's also a real consequence, right? And so I think there's a recent paper that came out that was like porn or partner, and it actually talks about how this is like an academic study that talks about how the people who are addicted or engaging in pornography are not able to form meaningful connections with their partners, and so
Mm.
they're like, it's literally one or the other.
It's
And so
binary.
yeah,
Yeah. It's crazy.
and I think
SubhanAllah.
that's something that we need to recognize, and something that we need to talk about, something that premarital counseling people need to be honest about with each other when they talk to prospective partners about, right? Like, either if you're struggling with it yourself, or ask about it, like, is this something you engage in? And be honest, because yes, while your sins are between you and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, this is going to be something that's going to affect this lifelong journey that you're
Mm-hmm.
looking to embark upon. And I think you might as well start it in a place of, from a place of truth and honesty, that then at least will hopefully, even if it is something that you're going to end up having to work together on, hopefully it's something that you can get out of someday.
Mm-hmm. I always like to finish the episodes with a way that somebody can take what they've listened to and turn it into action and something positive.
Yep.
So in this particular case, if somebody is struggling with an addiction, where would you recommend that they go?
So I think two good places to start would be two articles that are on yaqeeninstitute.org. One is one that I've written around talking to your kids about drugs, a Quranic approach, and we didn't talk about that a lot today, but you can go there as one. And then the other one is Zuhair Abdurrahman's article again about addiction. That really is a translation of Ibn Qayyim rahimahullah's Rawdat al-Muhibbin and the chapter on the desires. And so those would be two places to start as far as just gaining more knowledge on it.
Mm-hmm.
But I think the other piece that a practical aspect is talk about it. Talk about it early and often with your kids, with your spouses, with your parents. Let's like there are two things, and I think this is probably the lesson that I'll leave everybody with. When it comes to these things, be it alcohol, drugs, pornography, our religion takes a very balanced stance on it. When it takes a preventative approach for the general public, but for somebody who's fallen into it. So while you try to close the door for everybody from falling in, for somebody who has fallen in, the doors are flung wide open to help them get out. And I think that's the message that I would leave you with is when you look at Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when they see that a man keeps coming back. So we have the story of Abdullah, who is a Sahabi of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who used to make the Prophet ﷺ laugh. We have actually heard this, in the hadith actually mentions it. And we know of stories where he would, somebody would come to the market and be selling honey or something, for example. And he would take the honey from that person and then bring it to Rasulullah ﷺ and say, here, I got you a gift. And this whole time that person has been running behind him because he didn't pay him. And then he would say, pay him, Rasulullah ﷺ. But his struggle was alcohol. And so he would be brought back over and over again, and he would be punished for drinking alcohol. And so going back to that chronic relapsing thing, the hadith actually mentions over and over again, he would try to stay abstinent, and then he would fall back in, and then he would be brought back. And so somebody around Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam at that time said, how cursed is he that he is brought back for this over and over again. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, do not curse him, for verily I know that he loves Allah and His Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? So again, the doors at a population level, alcohol is forbidden. All forms of khamr are forbidden. All types of intoxicants are prohibited. And so the door, we try to close it as much as possible for people to fall in. But then we try to keep the door wide open for people to be able to get out. And so remember there that the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is open and is wide open, and reach out to Him, and only through support from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can you get out from any of this. So seek support from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with patience, with prayer, and with support networks, and with your friends, and somebody who can keep you honest. And that's what I'd probably leave you with.
Okay, barakallah feek. Thank you so much for the insightful discussion. Inshallah, it's not the last.
Inshallah.
We'll try to get this message out to more people, inshallah.
Inshallah. Jazakallah khairan.
Okay.